Welcome to another deep dive. We all want to get a good handle on complex topics without getting bogged down, right? I mean, who has the time to wade through mountains of research?
Not many of us. That's why we're here to do the heavy lifting.
Exactly. We break it down so you don't have to. And today we're diving into something pretty fundamental, how our thoughts and our feelings interact.
Yeah, we often talk about thinking and feeling as if they're totally separate things, like logic versus emotion.
But that's not really how it works, is it?
Not at all. The reality is much more interesting and much more complex.
So to guide us, we're turning to a really valuable resource, the Handbook of Cognition and Emotion. It was published back in 2013, but it still holds up as a collection of current research and theories in this ever-evolving field. It covers a huge range of topics, from basic processes to how cognition and emotion are involved in things like clinical disorders.
Right up to the social aspects of how we think and feel.
So it's a big one, but our goal is to distill the essence of it for you. How exactly do our thoughts and emotions work together? What are the core principles driving these interactions? It's a fascinating area of psychology, and we want to give you a solid grasp of the key insights.
And hopefully pique your curiosity to explore further on your own.
Speaking of exploration, the very fact that there's a whole handbook dedicated to cognition and emotion tells you something. This isn't some niche area of research. It's a field that has really exploded in recent decades, and you can really see that in the growth of specialized journals.
Right. Cognition and emotion kind of kicked things off back in 1987, and it's still going strong.
Then came emotion in 2001, also incredibly influential. More recently, we've seen journals like Social, Cognitive, and Affective Neuroscience, which digs deep into the brain mechanisms underlying these interactions. It really highlights the huge effort being put into understanding how thinking and feeling are connected.
And it's a connection that's turning out to be way more important than we ever realized. It used to be that we saw cognition and emotion as separate things, even opposing forces sometimes.
Like the classic head versus heart dilemma.
Exactly. But as research has progressed, it's become clear that they're not just linked, they're deeply intertwined. They constantly influence each other.
It's like a constant dance between the two.
And that's what makes this field so exciting. Figuring out the exact steps of that dance, how these interactions play out in all their complexity.
And this isn't just some theoretical exercise. Understanding this interplay has huge implications for how we understand and approach mental health challenges. The handbook dives into several specific disorders and how cognition and emotion are at play.
Anxiety disorders are a great example. The handbook emphasizes just how important our thought patterns are in these conditions.
It's not just about feeling anxious. It's about how our thinking can actually contribute to that anxiety.
Researchers are asking fundamental questions. Is there a common cognitive core to different anxiety disorders? Can we use this research to develop more effective treatments?
This is where the work of Morrison, Gordon, and Heimberg comes in. They did a review of cognitive perspectives on anxiety disorders and looked at all these different ways our thinking can be biased when we're struggling with anxiety.
Like noticing threats more easily,
Yeah.
maybe interpreting ambiguous situations as negative or dangerous.
They found that sometimes these biases look very similar across different types of anxiety, but sometimes they're quite distinct. So for you listening, the key takeaway here is that understanding these specific thinking patterns could be really important for tailoring support to different individuals.
And it's not just about identifying one particular bias. There's a growing emphasis on understanding how different cognitive biases relate to each other, how they might interact and feed into each other.
It's a much more complex picture than just having a single thinking error.
Right. And the handbook also highlights a really promising area of research, looking at whether these anxiety-related thinking patterns actually change when someone goes through successful therapy.
So it's not just about understanding the biases, it's about seeing if we can shift them.
Exactly. That could give us a concrete way to measure if a treatment is really working on a fundamental cognitive level.
Let's move on to another area that unfortunately affects a lot of people, PTSD. In this case, the focus is on the cognitive processes that seem to maintain and even worsen post-traumatic symptoms over time.
Right. Things like struggling to integrate those traumatic memories into your overall life narrative, or engaging in thought suppression, trying to push the memories away.
Which often backfires, doesn't it?
It does tend to have the opposite effect. The more you try to suppress something, the more it intrudes.
Yeah.
And then there's rumination, getting stuck in those cycles of replaying the past.
The handbook really emphasizes the need to consider both our thoughts and emotions together when we try to understand PTSD. It's not just about the emotional impact of trauma, it's about how our minds process and try to make sense of that experience.
And how that processing can sometimes go awry, leading to those really debilitating symptoms.
Then there's depression, a condition that touches so many lives. The handbook discusses the work of Aaron Beck, a pioneer in cognitive therapy. He really highlighted the role of our core beliefs about ourselves in depression, especially those beliefs related to our sense of worth.
It's like having a negative filter through which you view yourself and the world.
And the handbook points out that these negative core beliefs don't just come out of nowhere. They can be influenced by our genes, by our early childhood experiences, by the way our parents interacted with us. So these beliefs often have very deep roots.
It's not just about changing your thinking in the moment. It's about understanding where those patterns come from.
And there's another layer to this. Research shows that people with depression often have an attentional bias towards sad or negative information. They notice and focus on those things more easily.
The big question is why? Is it just mood congruence? Are they drawn to those things because they're feeling down?
Or is it something more self-referential, like they see those sad things as reflecting something negative about themselves?
A really important question, and one that researchers are still trying to answer. The handbook mentions some really cool research that's combining cognitive studies with brain imaging techniques like fMRI.
So we can actually see what's happening in the brain when people are processing emotional information.
Exactly. And that's allowing us to map out the specific brain networks that might be involved in these negative thinking patterns.
Let's switch gears and talk about borderline personality disorder, BPD. It's often characterized by really intense emotions, impulsivity, and difficulty in relationships. And the handbook raises a fascinating possibility that alongside the emotional dysregulation in BPD, there might also be underlying issues with attention.
So it's not just about managing emotions. It's about how they attend to and process information.
The idea is that individuals with BPD might be really attuned to facial expressions, and they might tend to interpret neutral or even positive expressions as negative.
Which can lead to a vicious cycle. They perceive negativity, which triggers strong emotional reactions, which then makes it even harder to pay attention and accurately interpret social information.
So they might see even more negativity. It's a feedback loop that can be really hard to break out of.
Absolutely. And that highlights the importance of addressing both the emotional and the cognitive aspects of BPD in treatment.
Now, for something a little different, let's talk about bipolar spectrum disorders, conditions characterized by shifts in mood and energy levels. The handbook introduces this concept of BAS hypersensitivity.
The behavioral activation system. Think of it as your brain's reward system, the network that gets activated when you anticipate or experience something positive.
So the idea is that people with bipolar disorder, or even folks with personality traits that lean towards hypomania, might have a more sensitive DAS.
They report being more motivated by potential rewards, and they tend to react more strongly to them.
And this BAS sensitivity seems to be a pretty stable trait. It's not just present during manic or hypomanic episodes.
Right. It might even be a vulnerability factor that contributes to those mood swings.
Now, for our last stop on the tour of psychopathology, the handbook touches on psychopathy and externalizing behaviors, things like impulsivity and rule breaking. And the discussion here focuses on different stages of attention.
There's early attention, which is more automatic,
Right.
filtering out irrelevant information. And then there's later attention, which is more about conscious control and regulation.
So the early stage is like a gatekeeper, letting in only what's important.
And the later stage is more about directing your focus and resisting distractions.
What the research suggests is that psychopathy might be associated with a bottleneck in that early stage of attention. They're not filtering out distracting information as effectively.
While externalizing behaviors might be more linked to problems with that later stage of control. So there's a different breakdown in attentional processing going on.
There's also some evidence that attention might actually influence things like fearlessness and the ability to inhibit impulsive behaviors in psychopathy. So the way they attend to the world might actually contribute to those core features of the condition.
It's a really interesting area of research.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of looking at these different cognitive processes in detail.
So we've seen how this interplay between thinking and feeling is crucial for understanding various psychological conditions. But what about the biological underpinnings of all this? The handbook also dives into the fascinating world of neurobiology.
The study of the brain and nervous system and how they give rise to our thoughts and emotions.
We've got all these amazing tools now to actually look at the brain in action. Things like fMRI and ERP.
fMRI gives us a great spatial picture. It shows us where in the brain activity is happening, while ERP is all about temporal precision. It tracks brain activity with millisecond accuracy.
So it tells us the sequence of events as they unfold in real time.
Exactly. And one ERP component that's really interesting is the late positive potential, or LPP. It seems to be particularly sensitive to how we process emotional stimuli.
And what's really cool is that our attention seems to play a role in how the LPT responds.
Studies have shown that directing your visual attention actually influences how emotional stimuli are processed, at least as reflected in the LPP. It suggests that attending to something is critical for fully processing its emotional significance.
It makes you wonder about the role of awareness in emotional processing. What happens when we're not consciously aware of something, but it still triggers an emotional response?
That's a great question. And research using subliminal presentations of emotional stimuli suggests that some level of processing is still happening even when we're not consciously aware of it. But the LPP isn't modulated in the same way. It seems like conscious attention plays a role in amplifying the emotional response.
The handbook also stresses the importance of understanding how different parts of the brain communicate with each other. Those bottom-up processes driven by incoming sensory information, and those top-down processes guided by our goals and expectations.
Knowing how these different regions are connected is crucial for figuring out how those bottom-up and top-down streams of information interact, where they meet, and how they influence each other.
It's not just about identifying individual brain regions, it's about understanding the network, the dynamic interplay between different parts of the brain.
And it's not just brain structures. Neurogenetics also plays a role. Genes involved in regulating dopamine, like COMT and DRD2, they can influence how our brains process both emotions and thoughts.
And then we have all those hormones that are coursing through our bodies. Cortisol, our stress hormone, and peptide hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin, they're involved in everything from our stress response to social bonding.
So it's a complex interplay of factors: genes, brain structures, neurochemicals, and hormones. They all contribute to this intricate dance between our thoughts and feelings.
Let's zoom in on some specific cognitive processes and how they connect with emotion. Attention, for example. It seems like a key intersection point.
Absolutely. Selective attention. Our ability to focus on certain things while filtering out others. It's fundamental to how we process emotional information. And the idea of automaticity is crucial here. The fact that emotional material can grab our attention so quickly and efficiently, often without us even realizing it.
It's like our brains are wired to prioritize things that are emotionally relevant, whether it's a potential threat or a potential reward.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research showing that attentional biases in anxiety can operate at very early stages of processing, even when the emotional information is presented subliminally, below our conscious awareness.
So even if we're not consciously aware of something, our brains are still picking up on those emotional cues, and that can influence how we react to the world.
Right. And research using the attentional blink paradigm has shown that emotional stimuli can actually reduce the blink. So even when our attention is already engaged by something else, a strong emotional cue can still break through.
It's like those emotional stimuli have a VIP pass to our attentional system.
Exactly. And eye movement studies have shown that people with anxiety tend to look at emotional stimuli more quickly and have a harder time looking away, even when they're instructed to do so.
So their attention is drawn to those emotionally charged things. And it's sticky. They get kind of stuck there.
And when we look at the brain, we see that these biases in attention are associated with altered activity in those limbic cortical regions, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex. They're all involved in how we process emotional information and regulate our responses.
Now for another fascinating cognitive process, generalization. It's basically the idea that when we learn to respond to one stimulus, we might also react to stimuli that are similar.
It's a fundamental learning mechanism. We don't just learn very specific associations. We extract general principles and apply them to new situations.
So if you have a bad experience with a certain type of dog, you might develop a fear of all dogs that look similar.
Exactly. And researchers talk about generalization gradients. The more similar the new stimulus is to the original one, the stronger the response will be.
But it's not a simple one-to-one relationship. The way generalization works for fear responses seems to be different from the way it works for inhibitory responses.
Right. Fear responses might generalize more broadly to a wider range of stimuli, which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. It's better to be safe than sorry.
The handbook also highlights that these generalization patterns aren't fixed. They can be influenced by all sorts of things: our attention, our perception, our memories. So there's hope for changing them through therapy.
Let's move on to appraisal theories. The idea that our emotions are triggered and shaped by how we evaluate the significance of events for our well-being.
So it's not just the event itself, it's the meaning we give it.
Exactly. If you get passed over for a promotion, one person might see it as a huge setback and feel devastated, while another person might see it as an opportunity to look for a new job that's a better fit.
And their emotional responses will be completely different, even though the event itself is the same.
The handbook stresses that this appraisal process is really at the core of what determines the specific emotion we experience.
So it's not just what happens to us, it's how we think about it.
And there are different models of appraisal. Some propose a dual mode system, rule-based reasoning versus associative learning. Others add a third mode, sensory motor responses.
So it's a complex process, but understanding those appraisals can be incredibly insightful in therapy.
Let's talk about memory now. We all know that emotional events tend to stick with us,
They're more vivid, easier to recall.
and there's a biological basis for that. Emotion actually enhances memory consolidation. It makes those memories stronger and more durable.
And the amygdala seems to play a key role here. It interacts with the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex to really solidify those emotional memories, especially during sleep.
It's like the amygdala tags those memories as important, and that makes them more likely to be stored in long-term memory.
The handbook also discusses mood-congruent memory, the tendency to remember things better if they match our current mood.
So if you're feeling down, you're more likely to recall negative memories, which can unfortunately create a vicious cycle in conditions like depression.
It's like your negative mood is priming those negative memories to come to the surface.
Exactly. And that can make it even harder to shift out of that negative state.
Let's flip things around now. How do our moods affect our general cognitive processes, not just memory for emotional events?
The handbook highlights the idea that our moods act as a kind of background influence. They color how we represent information and process our social experiences.
It's like our mood sets the stage, and everything else plays out on that stage.
The effect as information model is a great example. It suggests that we often use our current mood as a heuristic when making judgments, especially when we're not motivated to think things through or when our cognitive resources are stretched thin.
So if I'm in a good mood, I might be more likely to judge someone favorably, even if that good mood has nothing to do with the person themselves.
Exactly. It's like my mood is providing me with quick and dirty information about the situation, and I'm using that to guide my judgment.
But moods can also have more nuanced effects. The handbook mentions that negative moods can sometimes promote more detail-oriented processing.
Which can actually be helpful in some situations. It might reduce biases, like the fundamental attribution error, that tendency to overemphasize personal characteristics when explaining other people's behavior.
So sometimes a little bit of negativity can make us more careful and analytical.
And there's even research suggesting that our mood can influence how skeptical or gullible we are.
It's amazing how much our emotions can influence our thinking. It really highlights the need for emotional regulation, learning how to manage and influence our feelings.
That's a key theme in the handbook. Emotion regulation encompasses all those processes we use to influence which emotions we have, when we have them, and how we experience and express them.
So it's not just about suppressing emotions, it's about understanding them, working with them, and choosing how to respond to them.
Right. And the handbook makes a distinction between intrinsic regulation, regulating your own emotions, versus extrinsic regulation, trying to regulate someone else's emotions.
Which can be a whole other challenge.
It definitely is. And the process model of emotion regulation is a really helpful framework for understanding all of this. It outlines 5 points where we can intervene in the emotion-generating process.
Situation selection, situation modification, attentional deployment, cognitive change, and response modulation.
So it's not just about changing our emotional response in the moment. It's about recognizing that we have options in multiple stages.
We can choose to avoid certain situations. We can change the situation. We can shift our attention. We can reappraise the situation. Or we can try to change our behavioral or physiological response once the emotion is already happening.
The handbook really emphasizes the role of those more cognitive strategies, attentional deployment and cognitive change.
And we know from brain imaging studies that those strategies involve increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, that area associated with executive control and planning.
So it's like we're using our higher level thinking skills to manage our emotional responses.
Let's talk about embodied cognition now. This is the idea that our thinking isn't separate from our physical bodies. Our thoughts are actually grounded in our sensory experiences and our actions.
It challenges that traditional view of the mind as separate from the body, like a brain in a vat.
It's a much more holistic view, recognizing that our bodies play a role in shaping our thoughts and feelings.
The handbook gives some really cool examples of how this plays out, like how the orientation of an object in a picture can be influenced by the way you read about it in a sentence.
So if you read about hammering a nail into a floor, you're faster to recognize a picture of a nail pointing downwards. It's like your brain is simulating the action of hammering as you're reading.
And there's evidence from cognitive neuroscience showing that modality-specific brain areas become active when we're thinking about properties related to that sense. So if you're thinking about the color of something, your visual cortex might light up.
It really blurs the lines between thinking and perceiving.
And there's also the phenomenon of mimicry, the way we often unconsciously imitate other people's expressions.
Which might be a way of tapping into their emotional state. By subtly embodying their expressions, we might actually get a sense of what they're feeling.
It's a fascinating area of research, and it highlights how interconnected our minds and bodies really are.
Let's move on to something we all struggle with from time to time: repetitive negative thoughts, rumination, worry. The handbook explores how these cognitive patterns can really affect our emotions.
Rumination, dwelling on those negative feelings and their causes. It can really prolong and intensify those negative moods.
It's like getting stuck in a loop of negativity.
And worry. Focusing on potential future threats, it can create a lot of anxiety and distress.
The handbook highlights that whether these types of thinking are helpful or harmful really depends on the content of the thoughts and the context.
Ruminating about a problem can sometimes lead to finding a solution. But if it's just going over the same negative thoughts again and again, it's unlikely to be productive.
There's also this idea of the impaired disengagement hypothesis, specifically related to depression. It suggests that people with depression might have a harder time disengaging from those negative thoughts.
Their attention gets kind of stuck on the negative, and it makes it harder to shift to something more positive or neutral.
Now, for a topic that's always fascinating, self-control. We often think of emotions as being at odds with self-control, like we need to suppress our feelings in order to be disciplined.
That's the traditional view, but the handbook presents a more nuanced perspective.
The idea of hedonic emotion regulation, where sometimes we do things that undermine our long-term goals because we're trying to manage negative emotions in the short term.
Like stress eating or impulse shopping. Those behaviors might make us feel better in the moment, but they don't serve us in the long run.
It's like our emotions are hijacking our self-control system.
And what's interesting is that both positive and negative emotions can impair or improve self-control depending on the situation and the individual. It's not a simple equation.
The handbook also mentions a specific brain region, the anterior midcingulate cortex. It seems to be involved in integrating negative emotions with cognitive control processes. So it might play a role in helping us navigate those challenging situations where our emotions are pushing us in one direction and our goals are pulling us in another.
It's like the AMCC is the mediator between our heart and our head.
Now let's shift gears and talk about how all these intricate interactions between thinking and feeling develop throughout our lives.
The way we understand emotions in childhood has really evolved. We used to see them as immature, irrational, something to be controlled by developing cognitive abilities.
But now we recognize that emotions are actually crucial for healthy development.
They play an important role in learning, self-awareness, and social interaction. They're not something to be suppressed.
It's like emotions are the fuel for development. They provide the motivation and the information we need to learn and grow.
The handbook emphasizes how cognitive and emotional skills are intertwined throughout development, and how that can impact things like academic achievement.
So it's not about prioritizing one over the other. It's about recognizing their interconnectedness and supporting the development of both.
And finally, let's talk about personality. How our individual differences in personality can influence our emotional experiences.
The handbook discusses some classic theories like Eysenk's and Gray's models. They link extroversion to arousability and sensitivity to rewards.
So extroverts might experience more positive emotions and be more drawn to positive information.
While neuroticism is linked to negative emotionality, and it can also influence things like attention, working memory, and memory recall.
People high in neuroticism might be more attuned to negative information and have a harder time letting go of negative experiences.
And then there's agreeableness, that tendency to be cooperative and compassionate. It's been linked to caregiving motivations.
So people high in agreeableness might be more focused on the well-being of others, and that can shape their emotional responses.
The handbook also talks about emotional intelligence, EI, specifically the ability model of EI, which sees it as a set of mental abilities.
The ability to understand and manage your own emotions, and to perceive and understand the emotions of others.
So it's not just about being in touch with your feelings, it's about being able to use that information effectively.
And research has shown that higher EI can have a positive impact on things like academic achievement, social behavior, and mental health.
It's like having a toolkit for navigating the emotional landscape.
And finally, the handbook concludes with a discussion of cognitive bias modification, CBM. These are interventions that aim to directly change those unhelpful cognitive biases we've been talking about.
So it's not just about understanding our biases, it's about actually trying to shift them.
Exactly. There are different types of CBM, targeting attention, interpretation, and memory.
And studies have shown that these interventions can actually be effective in reducing things like anxiety and depression.
It's a really promising area of research. And it highlights the potential for actually changing those deep-seated patterns of thinking and feeling.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the Handbook of Cognition and Emotion. It really is a treasure trove of information about the complex and fascinating interplay between our thoughts and feelings.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic processes to the clinical implications, from neurobiology to personality.
But it's just a starting point. There's so much more to explore.
And we hope this deep dive has given you a solid foundation, a framework for understanding how your own thoughts and feelings interact.
Because ultimately, that's what matters. What's happening inside each of us, how our own minds and hearts are working together.
And the handbook provides a map, a guide to understanding that inner landscape.
So take this map and explore. Dive deeper into the areas that resonate with you and keep asking questions, because the more we understand about this intricate relationship, the more empowered we become to create a richer and more fulfilling life.
Exactly. It's a journey of self-discovery. And it starts with recognizing that our thoughts and feelings are not separate entities. They're partners in a complex and beautiful dance.
So let's keep dancing, keep learning, and keep exploring the amazing world of cognition and emotion. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.